Welcome to the Portals Numerology course, Module 1A, where we're looking at the history of numerology in numbers, superstitions, and the Portals method. I'll be explaining later on in this module about why we've chosen Pythagoras' method. We'll also be looking at the Chaldean method and why that differs so much. So, without further ado, let's get into it and learn a bit more about Pythagoras. Considered by many to be the father of numerology, Pythagoras of Samos lived in the times of the ancient Greeks between 570 to 495 BC and was an Ionian Greek philosopher as well as the founder of Pythagoreanism. Some say that his teachings helped to spawn the Golden Age of Greece, and his university was established in the Greek colony of Crotona in southern Italy around 532 BC. The Pythagorean University welcomed everyone, and no one was discriminated against, although it was said to have had strict doctrines that all students had to abide by, such as sharing all possessions and living a monastic life. Members were bound by a vow to each other and Pythagoras, which involved observing ascetic and religious pursuits as well as studying his philosophy. It was said that Pythagoreans ate like Spartans, which included vegetarianism. Pythagoras' philosophy gave us his famous quote, "Man, know thyself, then thou shalt know the universe and God." Early life and education. There are many myths and legends surrounding Pythagoras' life. He was said to have been the son of a gem engraver called Narsarchus on the island of Samos, which was a thriving hub of culture and architectural engineering. Pythagoras went to the Near East in his early years, where he is thought to have received most of his education, believed to have been heavily influenced by the cultures of the Mesopotamians and the Levantine. He was also said to have studied in Egypt, where he was a disciple of an Egyptian arch-prophet, Soches. While there, he studied geometry and metempsychosis, transmigration of souls, believing that every soul is immortal, entering a new body after death. Pythagoras was also said to have been a disciple of Plato of Sesnuphus, Heliopolis. There are other ancient writers who believed that Pythagoras received his education in Persia from the Magi or Zoroaster, who was also known as Zarathustra, the Iranian prophet. Other sources for his studies were said to have been the Jews, the Phoenicians, where he learned arithmetic, and he received an education in astronomy from the Chaldeans. In the 2nd century BC, novelist Antonius Diogenes wrote that Pythagoras learned everything through the interpretation of dreams. Philostratus was a Greek sophist, means specializing in one or more subjects, in the 3rd century BC, who claimed that Pythagoras also learned from Hindu sages in India, and he is even said to have studied with the Iberians and the Celts. Pythagoras' teachings and philosophy. Pythagoras' philosophical and political teachings were well known in the coastal areas of southern Italy and were said to have influenced Aristotle, Plato, and then Western philosophy. He is said to have created the doctrine of musica universalis, which attributes the movements of the planets to mathematical equations and the resulting resonation of inaudible musical symphonies. Throughout history, Pythagoras was credited with a variety of scientific and mathematical discoveries, including the Pythagorean theorem. In Euclidean geometry, which was a mathematical system said to have been developed by the Alexandrian Greek mathematician Euclid, the theorem is the essential relation between the three sides of a right triangle. The sum of two squares, A and B, whose sides are equal to the square whose side is a hypotenuse, C. Pythagorean tuning, a musical tuning system where the frequency ratios of all the intervals are based on 3, 2, a ratio called the perfect fifth, considered the easiest to tune by ear. See the perfect fifth, showing relation between frequency ratio and interval values in cents, which is a unit of measure for musical intervals. The theory of proportions, where two sequences of numbers in experimental mathematics are proportional if their related elements have a constant ratio. The y variable is proportional directly to the x variable with proportionality constant, as you can see, and so on. While there are some historians who debate over whether Pythagoras made these discoveries, they are historically attributed to him, particularly his philosophy in relation to numbers and mathematics. Said to have been the first to call himself a philosopher, a lover of wisdom, his teachings influenced Plato, and his ideas on perfect mathematical equations had an impact on ancient Greek art. In the 1st century BC, his teachings went through a major revival among Middle Platonists, a stage in the development of Platonic philosophy. His teachings had a major influence throughout the Middle Ages, and his philosophy impacted scientists such as Copernicus, Isaac Newton, and Johann Kepler. Early modern European esotericism used Pythagorean symbolism extensively. Ovid's Metamorphoses included Pythagoras' teachings, which went on to influence vegetarianism. He also introduced the concept of graduated learning, which is still adhered to in today's education systems. Pythagorean mysticism. The harmony of the spheres was a Pythagorean belief that the stars and planets move according to mathematical equations, which correspond to musical notes, producing an inaudible symphony. It was said that Pythagoras taught how the 7 muses, Greek goddesses who inspired the arts, literature and science, were the 7 planets, the Moon, Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter and Saturn, singing together. The Pythagoreans were attributed with the alignment of letters to numbers, which will be discussed in a later module. Also said to have practiced prophecy and divination, Pythagoras' teachings were synthesized with Christian theology and Jewish Kabbalah by Johann Reuchlin, who was a German humanist scholar between 1455 and 1522 AD. He believed that Pythagoras was a Kabbalist, and he stated that the Pythagorean Tetractys was comparable to the divine Yahweh, the name of the national god of Israel. The Pythagorean Tetractys is said to symbolize the 4 elements of earth, air, fire and water. It was an important symbol for the Pythagoreans, considered to be mystical, since it also represents the 4 seasons and is associated with music and the movement of the planets. Influences. Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, 1486 to 1535 AD, wrote the popular thesis 3 Books of Occult Philosophy, where he claimed that Pythagoras was a religious magi and that his numerology resonates with the supercelestial world, where the angels and Godhead reside. The Freemasons, who modelled their society on the Pythagorean community at Croton. Rosicrucianism, where Pythagorean symbolism was used. The Illuminati, whose founder advocated for a society like that of the Pythagoreans. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, who incorporated the symbolism in the magic flute. Pythagorean numbers were used throughout Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy, since he was fascinated with numerology, and he based his descriptions of heaven, hell and purgatory on numbers. He wrote that Pythagoras understood unity as good and plurality as evil. In the image, Dante and Beatrice gaze upon the highest heaven, which was one of Gustave Doré's illustrations for the Divine Comedy. Numerology. The purpose of life, according to Pythagoras, was that the ultimate state of being is perfection. Believing that mathematics were the principles of all things, he taught that numbers govern every aspect of life and that they can help to predict the future. The Pythagoreans believed that odd numbers are masculine and that even numbers are feminine. They also regarded the number 10 as the perfect number, although I only use the base numbers 1 to 9 since they are the primary numbers that all others consist of, and 0 is a void or a multiplier, which is the way I was taught. The numbers in the Tetractys add up to 10, which is why the Pythagoreans swore oaths by it and consider it a mystical symbol. While certain scholars state that the Pythagoreans did not practice numerology, it has been said that later adherents developed the practice based on other ancient sources. They were also said to have master numbers 11 and 22, but my teacher advised, and I agree, that when you reduce the numbers to single digits, the properties are the same. Personally, I've always thought that it was a form of self-aggrandizement to say you were a master, so I have stuck to what I was taught, which has proved to be a solid method for me. Legacy. The Pythagorean understanding of the mathematical order and harmony of the universe was a theory that Isaac Newton adhered to, and he attributed the law of universal gravitation discovery to Pythagoras. Albert Einstein considered the notion of logical simplicity as an effective tool for his research, believing that it was in keeping with Pythagorean processes. Many scientists and philosophers also agreed that following the Pythagorean tradition was closer to modern science since they were mathematicians. There are modern scholars who debate whether Pythagoras was the one who developed numerological methods and state that Philolaus of Croton, a later Pythagorean, was responsible. After Croton's victory in 510 BC over Sybaris, an important city in the coastal areas of southern Italy, the Pythagoreans came into conflict with the supporters of democracy, and their meeting places were burned. Some say that Pythagoras might have been killed during that time, or that he escaped to nearby Metapontum and died there. Pythagorean teachings were eventually driven underground as the persecutions went on. It's interesting to note that Pythagoras' rise happened around the same time as Confucius and Buddha. His legacy survived, even though there are no known writings directly produced by him that exist, which only adds to the mystery. Task 2. Write a page in your workbook about how numbers have affected you personally in your life. Any observations about particular numbers or combinations? The Portal's Numerology Method. As explained in the introduction video, I studied numerology with Elia when I was 22 years old. She was an American psychologist living in Australia at the time, originally from Waco, Texas. Elia developed her lessons by infusing what she explained as the Pythagorean method with psychological interpretations. What I liked about Elia was the way she explained numerology in a no-nonsense way, preferring to keep the esoteric side out of her interpretations. It was strange to me, since she delved into other forms of divination and meditation, such as pendulums and the silver mind control method. The latter involves creative visualization and meditation to increase abilities such as clairvoyance, psychism, and higher brain functions. As a side note, she used this method to fend off a would-be rapist. She was a force to be reckoned with. Elia didn't use multiple numbers, preferring to reduce them to single digits to access their true essence, even though house numbers and combinations need to be interpreted in relation to each other, which will be explored in a later module. In keeping with her ideas of keeping numerology relatively free of esoteric influences, she dismissed Chaldean numerology, which is an older and more spiritual method, relying on intuition, but regarding numbers differently. For example, the personalities of the numbers in the Chaldean system are different, and they only use the numbers from 1 through 8, even though they use 9 in some situations. The Pythagorean method pays more attention to the name of the querent, the full name at birth, rather than the everyday name, although Elia taught me how to interpret both. What I like about the Pythagorean method, as taught to me by Elia, which could be given a different name since she included psychological considerations, is that it's more concise and continues to evolve, while the Chaldean method has pretty much stayed the same since it was developed back in the days of Babylon. Another element of Chaldean numerology is the fact that it's more in tune with astrology and archaic religion rather than the lives of mortals. However, the mystical undertones might be appealing to some people. The Chaldeans used sounds to match the vibrations of numbers and letters, and Chaldean numerology relies greatly on astrology. While I'm teaching a different method, it's entirely up to you to develop your own style and use what works for you. I moved on from Elia's teachings to include elements and correspondences to enhance my readings, but this course was developed so you can choose what you want to learn and leave out things like karmic astrology, ritual, etc. to suit yourself. Of course, if you decide to complete every module, you can still go on to develop the kind of numerology that speaks to you, like I did with Elia's teachings. The power of numerology, like any divinatory practice, depends on the knowledge of the practitioner rather than the system. I use numerology as a guide, but I'm not a slave to it. I don't let it dictate every aspect of my life, but I do like to check in and see how the numbers resonate with my life and what might happen in the future. It's a fun endeavour that can give you great insights into people and situations. In the end, it's all about personal preference. Science, superstition, and everyday life. Everything in the universe is comprised of numerical equations. If you're fascinated by numbers, you'll see the beauty in sacred geometry, the order of nature, and how numbers affect everything in our lives, whether we recognize them or not. Some of us notice patterns and are often haunted by repetitions, such as the 1111 phenomena or certain numbers continuously popping up in our everyday lives. Notwithstanding the fact that humans like to attribute meaning to seemingly random numbers, symbols, objects, places or people, when we discover our own numerology and how numbers work, the realization that more is going on under the surface appears to validate our curiosity and therefore our belief in the power of numbers. Numbers are usually terribly important when it comes to things like how fast we drive, how much medicine we take, how often we eat, weather events, and so on. Without knowing the basic facts and figures in most situations, it becomes either difficult or impossible to prepare. Numbers are involved in the elements of the basic fabric of our reality, including time, space, money, especially things like stock market analysis, and the very struggle for survival, including food and shelter. It's easy to slip into the altruistic side of speculation and to assume, seeing as numbers are essentially man-made and supposedly used only for ratios and calculations, that the attributed meaning of numbers is simply a projected myth. Fair enough, but try and tell that to a poor person where every dollar counts, or try and create a delicate dish that requires correct ratios and balance. The frustrating thing about how numerology is perceived today relates to the way it is lumped in with other occult practices, such as astrology and other methods of divination. My personal attitude towards numerology does fluctuate according to how I feel on any particular day, but when I take a deeper look, I'm always amazed at the accuracy of it, which never changes, unlike me. I'm not one to be obsessed by numerical patterns, and I do my best to assess a situation from all angles before jumping to a conclusion, but at the end of the day, numerology seems to be the only constant. The only variable is interpretation, which does essentially affect the outcome, unless you strictly adhere to the meanings of each number as well as their combinations. For example, a 6th day could mean focus on the home and family, but it also relates to the arts and harmony, especially music. If you notice the number 6 a lot in your life, it could mean that family or the home is a focus right now. At the time, you should be able to figure out what it means to you. Our planet and everything in it follow patterns and rhythms dictated by the cycles of life. Certain periods in life provide us with the conditions, opportunities and resources in order to complete a particular cycle in preparation for the next. These cycles are governed by essences or numbers which reflect a particular characteristic of the experiences and lessons that need to be learned. The numerological essence of our names, surroundings and cycles indicate the moods we may be in, new paths that need to be discovered, new people we need to meet, and situations that, even though sometimes stressful, help the soul gather as much wisdom as it can in order to live full lives. Numerology reveals meaning and order. Everything that is and everything that happens is ruled by the influence of numbers. Numerology maps out the course of our lives, including pit stops and interruptions, opportunities, times of sorrow, and times of celebration. The study of shapes, numbers, and corresponding structures is called mathematics. What's interesting is how mathematics reveals the fabric of the universe, while numerology reveals the working of our minds. In science, large numbers and equations are used extensively, but they can be confusing for non-scientific minds to read. When trying to explain things like molecules or distances, writing down the equations in full could fill a book. This is why scientists created a system called scientific notation, which allows them to abbreviate numbers so equations are easier to handle, working in tens. Exploring the universe with spaceflight, calculating weather patterns, formulating medicine and surgery procedures are only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to how science uses numbers. What about superstition? Believing that certain objects, events, or actions can cause supernatural influences, good and bad, is known as superstition, which can result in irrational fears and sometimes bizarre behaviour and phobias. Things such as amulets and charms are worn or carried to induce luck or ward off evil and seemingly unlucky outcomes. Strange religious beliefs and the practice of fortune-telling are often thought of as superstitious, and the fear or preference of certain numbers are also considered to be in this category. For a long time, many people have thought of even numbers to be good and uneven numbers to be bad, such as the number 13. Some of us get excited when a Friday falls on the 13th, giving us a thrill when discussing the day, like a mini Halloween. Some of us become superstitious and fearful, doing our best to avoid doing anything, like leaving the house. It's strange because Jesus had 12 disciples, but if you count him, the number is 13. When St. Matthias was chosen to replace Judas Iscariot after the latter betrayed Jesus, he could have been considered the 13th. Witches' covens across Europe have historically included 13 members, but if that includes the high priest or high priestess, the same issue could be compared to that of Jesus and his disciples. Some have stated that witches use the idea of 13 members in defiance of Christianity. When you reduce the number 13 to a single digit, it becomes the number 4, which is usually about work and practical matters. So the sting of the so-called unlucky 13 is eradicated. Other supposedly unlucky numbers include 666. A multiple of sixes, this number is feared due to its attribution to the devil, since John the Apostle claimed in the book of Revelations that it's the number of the beast, interpreted to be the Antichrist. It's interesting to note that if you reduce it to a single digit, it becomes 9, which is an all-encompassing number that governs compassion and completion, among other things. Number 4. The pronunciation of the number 4 in Chinese is similar to their word for death. Like the number 13, Chinese buildings usually skip the inclusion of a 4th floor. Number 39. In Afghanistan, the number 39 translates to Mordegao, meaning dead cow. This term is also used colloquially for a pimp, to keep in line with the negative connotation of prostitution. When reduced to a single digit, the number 3, which relates to creativity and communication. Number 9. In Japan, the number 9, Kyu, is feared due to its relation to their word for suffering or torture, giving it a bad luck vibe. Number 17. In Italy, Friday the 17th is considered ominous since it involves the rearranging of the Roman numeral 17, resulting in the word VIXI, which is Latin for my life is over. There can be other personal superstitions about numbers depending on events in our lives that harken back to a dark time or unlucky circumstances, but that depends on whether they're real or irrational fears or simply coincidence. Coincidence or fate? There are countless stories around the world about numerical coincidences, and some of them are so incredible that it's hard to explain them away, although selective reporting is one explanation. Your senses are heightened when triggered by the recurrence of images, events, or numbers, but it's still intriguing to explore them. Carl Jung wrote extensively about meaningful coincidences, which he termed synchronicity, focusing on the role of archetypes with an avid interest in quantum mechanics, Chinese philosophy, and the theory of seriality, suggested by Paul Camara, a Viennese biologist. Jung created his idea of synchronicity, meaning falling together in time. Here is a small collection of coincidences involving numbers and dates. Mark Twain, the famous American writer, was born in 1835, which was the same year that Halley's Comet first appeared. He passed away in 1910, which was when the comet made its second appearance. Stephen Hawking, the cosmologist and theoretical physicist, was born on the 300th anniversary of Galileo's death and died on what would have been Einstein's 139th birthday. Flight 666. The Finnair Flight 666 left Copenhagen and landed in Helsinki on Friday the 13th. However, the passengers arrived safely. The 50th anniversary of American independence. American presidents John Adams and Thomas Jefferson both died on this day in 1826. Psalm 46. This psalm in the King James Bible was published in the year that Shakespeare turned 46 years old, but most surprising is that the word shake is the 46th word, and the 46th word from the end is spear. The 23 Enigma. American author and agnostic mystic Robert Anton Wilson discussed how the beat author William Burroughs was the first to believe in the 23 Enigma, which involves the recurrence of the number 23. Wilson stated that Burroughs knew a man named Captain Clark in 1960, who'd boasted about having sailed for 23 years without an accident. It was that day when the captain's ship was involved in an accident, resulting in his own death and the passengers. Afterwards, Burroughs heard a news bulletin on the radio announcing an airliner crash in Florida, USA. It was Flight 23, and the pilot was named Captain Clark. The law of fives, as explained in the text Principia Discordia, states that all things happen in groups of five, or are multiples of, or divisible by five. Regarded as a consequence of the law of fives, the 23 enigma can be broken down as 2 plus 3 equals 5. The number 23 is considered to be mysterious, as depicted in the 2007 movie The Number 23, which starred Jim Carrey in a story about a man who becomes obsessed with the number 23. 1111. The 1111 phenomenon is about the recurrence of the time or these numbers witnessed in everyday life and or on clocks. Some believe that this is an omen, good or bad, that signifies an important event looming or heralding auspicious circumstances. Task 3. Write a page in your workbook about your thoughts on numerical coincidences, as well as any recurring numbers in your life which may or may not make sense to you. Also write about any superstitions you may have had about a particular number or date.